Portland, Oregon has just declared a state of emergency, and millions of people are having intermittent internet access and having a lot of software problems with things that are going on. People, with airline traffic and with other computers and all this stuff going on today. A lot of questions about what is going on. Why is this happening? Is it going to get worse? Is it going to expand? And does this impact Bitcoin? So in this video today, I'm going to break down what exactly is going on with these internet outages worldwide that are affecting millions of users. Why did it happen? What is going on with CrowdStrike, this company all of a sudden that overnight everyone has heard about, despite yesterday nobody having ever heard of it before? And ultimately, can this get worse? Will it get worse? And if it is going to get worse, what potential solution could Bitcoin provide? I personally believe this is going to get worse, and so I'll get into that here. So first of all, what exactly is going on? Apparently, the headline story, and obviously this may change, but from what I'm reading, essentially what's happened is that CrowdStrike, this company that is developing software, had a bad update that affected various Microsoft programs and computers, and so now millions of people are having bad issues when it comes to the internet and it comes to the software, right? There are signs in Times Square in New York City that are not working. There are millions of people are having trouble with their flights. There's all kinds of banking problems, right? And of course, banking, money, Bitcoin, that's all kind of related, right? So just lots of technical problems. Does it seem like a systemic risk that, is going to collapse the world? No, obviously it doesn't seem like that, or at least right now. But I do think it's really important to make a video about, and I do think it's important to answer the questions I've been seeing, both anecdotally and personally in the last few hours about this. In the end of the day, if you're going to be engineering a system, whether it's analog, digital, whatever, software, hardware, if we're going to be engineering any system, a malicious attack versus an accident, in the end, is the same. It's the same result. Obviously, there's the moral question, but in the end, if a system is open, if a system is vulnerable in any way to any form of attack from ignorance or attack from malice, it's the same end result, and it's still a flawed system, right? There are three instances that come to my mind personally in the last couple months alone, which all three are quite concerning. Obviously, this one is being one of them, that, we had one update and now millions of people are having these problems, okay? To the point where cities are declaring states of emergency and travel all of a sudden is really difficult. Banking information, everything else is being really delayed. This is a major single point of failure, critical problem that is now permeated to millions and millions of people across the entire planet. This obviously is one of those examples of an engineering system that has kind of had a major crisis. Another one, though, is the security around Donald Trump, right? And I'm not getting political here. I'm getting to a larger point. The assassination attempt on Donald Trump, some people, let's say the conspiracy theorists, those people would say that this might have been something intentional. There might have been intentional negligence, either from the Social Security, higher up, whatever. I'm not saying an opinion there. I'm just saying that is something that a lot of people are theorizing. And a lot of other people are saying, I don't think there was actual malice against Donald Trump and that these other politicians were trying to take Trump out, quote unquote. But it was just, critical errors, critical oversights by the Secret Service. My point is that in the end, practically, yes, the answer to that question does matter. The same thing here in this case with the CrowdStrike scenario. It doesn't matter if CrowdStrike was compromised from a malicious attack or out of incompetence and a bad update. Yes, that answer definitely matters. But in the end, on the end user experience and the actual systemic security perspective, it's actually irrelevant because either way it could happen, and so therefore it did, right? And again, going back literally a week ago today at the time of recording, before this CrowdStrike thing has emerged, it's the same thing with the assassination attempt. Yes, it does matter if it was malicious negligence from the Social Security, or not Social Security, Secret Service, different SS. Secret Service, it doesn't matter if it's negligence or malicious, but in the end, either way, Donald Trump's still dead, or at least theoretically he would have been dead, right? And so my point is that any security system, whether it's something analog, like literally protecting a human life, like the President of the United States, or it's a digital system, that same line is fuzzy, it's still blurred, right? Intention matters, but in the end, if any security system has a flaw that either by malice or negligence can be exploited, it will be exploited in a given amount of time. I think the other example in the last few months that makes a lot of sense to bring up again, and this is something I talked about in multiple videos back when it happened, but the solar flare that happened a few months ago. There was a big solar flare, right? You probably remember this. There were all the northern lights in northern Europe, the United States. Most people have already forgotten that, right? The news cycle has moved on, but it's really important. That only happened a couple months ago, and that's another example. It doesn't matter if we intentionally neglect the electric grids of the world, or if just out of laziness, ignorance, and sloth, we don't upgrade them. But in the end, it's the same result. Oh my goodness, we have a baby robin down here. What's up? What's up, buddy? How you doing? Don't want to scare you. I don't know. Hey. Anyway, sorry about that. Okay, bye. Anyway, same thing with the bird's nest, right? It doesn't matter if the bird was kicked out of the nest or the nest wasn't stable. The bird fell out of the nest either way. So, well, he probably didn't fall out the nest. Mom's probably not too far away. Anyway, getting back to the point. The point is, with the solar flare, I think the same thing is very true, right? It doesn't matter if we're neglecting the electric grids of the world or if some enemy state is, in some deep state systematic way intentionally undermining grid security of the United States. In the end, if the solar flare comes, it doesn't matter why the grid wasn't updated. It just matters that the grid wasn't updated, and now we have this problem, right? And so, with all that context rambled out and said, the reason I believe this is going to get worse, the reason I believe we're going to see more things like this, is because technology is on this exponential curve of change. It's getting faster and faster and faster, right? This is the point I've made repeatedly in numerous videos and articles I've written now and blog posts about how we have less technologically in common with the near future than the ancient past, right? And I think that's really, really important. Some people think that's just blind optimism I have. And yes, it is generally, I think, an optimistic statement. But I think also there is a level of angst in that too. Because let's take the Donald Trump example again. That is just now with modern technology. That was one lone shooter, or at least that's what the main story is right now. One lone shooter with a gun from the modern era. Okay, my friends, what happens if in 20 years drone technology advances to the point where assassin drones or killer drone bots, it's obviously our security systems at defending the most powerful political person in the world, who I would argue is, Donald Trump or the president, one of the two most powerful political figures in the world. Our security systems are so flawed that we can't even protect against modern technology. Okay, again, what happens if in 10, 20 years we have all these little killer robots and we have these people, the amount of change technologically that's coming and the threats that are coming are getting exponentially larger, right? And the honeypot is becoming exponentially larger too. Because as the presidents, in this case, in charge of these nations are able to control more and more powerful militaries, more and more powerful forms of energy, the incentive rises to control that person or take that person out, right? It is a president in the early 21st century in charge of nuclear bombs is a bigger incentive and target to take control of that versus a president in 1943 or a government authority in 1943 that doesn't have the nuclear bomb, right? As technology continues on that curve, we are increasing the incentive to exploit single points of failure and the amount of time we have to adjust and defend and shift our security systems to compensate for those new single points of failure. That timeline is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and we clearly are not doing a well enough job today. So, oh, hey, we have a little toad here too. Just nature world today. Anyway, so in regards to CrowdStrike, what do I know about CrowdStrike? Frankly, not that much. I've been out living my life today. Obviously, I know basically nothing about CrowdStrike. But what I do know is that in the end, I think this is a very telling sign of that exact direction that I'm describing. The world is getting more and more and more digital. The world is getting more and more reliant on the internet. We have this increasing honeypot of the internet, right? There is a greater and greater incentive every single year for someone that wants to do harm or just someone that wants to control to take advantage, threaten, or control the internet, right? Or various pieces of software attached with the internet, right? And so that honeypot is growing every single year, and the security failures are having higher and higher stakes, right? And clearly we are not capable of handling what we already have today. How big is that problem going to be in 10 years, 20 years, or longer, right? That's the question that I think is really interesting to ask. Obviously there are the shorter term questions of what does this specific thing about CrowdStrike mean? And that's what the mainstream media, you can click elsewhere on the internet to learn about that, the immediate consequences of the next 6 hours and 6 days. But I'm more interested in the next 6 years and 60 years of what kinds of problems are we going to see emerge and how do we adjust for those, right? I think artificial intelligence is another really good example, right? Imagine if instead of supposedly what is the case now of negligence of a bad software update from CrowdStrike affecting these millions of people, what happens if in 10 years, 20 years, we have terrorists that no longer want to, let's say, bomb buildings to convince people to do various things, or, scare tactics, threaten the analog world? What if it becomes a better, more advantageous strategy for them to have these digital forms of warfare, right? It's that, I'm not going to hold hostage 100 human beings. I'm going to hold hostage your critical computer infrastructures that manage the lives of 100 million people, right? Obviously, both those things are going to happen, and we are in a fallen world, and so evil is not going to go away. More and more technological progress is not going to somehow magically make humans more moral, more virtuous, or any less depraved than we already are. The point I'm making is that that's not going to go away, and we're marching right into those problems, and we don't really have a clear solution, because ultimately, bigger gun diplomacy always trends towards the biggest guns. That's exactly what we see with politicians. That's exactly what we see in game theory of war. That's exactly what we see in economics and everything else, right? The bigger gun diplomacy always trends towards the biggest guns, right? This is why throughout all of political history, political rivals and competitors always trend towards two major political parties or factions. This is exactly why we see this with nations, right? You have a trending not to 4 or 3 different sides in a war. You always see it trending towards 2, right? We always see this battle. If you have 10 different small guns, they're always going to clump together and congregate until you have big gun 1, big gun 2. And of course, as technology gets exponentially bigger honeypot, exponentially bigger targets, those wars also get exponentially bigger, right? And so that is the concern. So what on earth does Bitcoin have to do with any of those things? Well, the reason I care about Bitcoin, it's not actually about Bitcoin, is because I believe humans are not righteous enough to control those things on our own. I don't think we are. I believe the only 2 possible solutions are, number 1, all humans forever are magically now all-knowing and magically without sin or evil or malice, right? That's the only way to make sure that we never have these kinds of mistakes, right? That way you're protecting against the bad bugs that are updated into pieces of software, and you're protecting against the people that are actively malicious and trying to take advantage of security systems, right? That's the only way that you reduce the need of the Secret Service forever. That's the only way you reduce these CrowdStrike problems forever. That's the only way you fix the world, let's say, in that sense, is that somehow if humans see all possible futures, all possible outcomes, all-knowing, omnipotent, and also are without evil. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen. So the only other solution I could possibly see to that question, to that problem, is we need some sort of security system that does not rely on humans. Because humans make mistakes, humans are fallible, and humans also, even if they don't make mistakes unintentionally, they might intentionally have malice or evil or direct energy towards an evil initiative, right? And so, to me, that's what Bitcoin is. That's what, to me, is so fascinating about Bitcoin uniquely, is that what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is a algorithm that once set in motion, now it's outside of human control, right? No individual human or no collective of human beings can go backwards into Bitcoin's chain, into Bitcoin's time chain, blockchain, whatever you want to call it, and change the past. We don't technically know how to do that. And in the end, it doesn't matter if we don't know how to do that from a malicious perspective or a accidental perspective. We just don't know how to do that, right? Like, yes, we might bring bad updates to Bitcoin in the same way that CrowdStrike brought a bad update to its software. Now millions of people are paying the price for it, and the company's probably going to pay the price too. With Bitcoin, yes, you can add updates to it, and those updates might be bad, but because Bitcoin is just information, and because it's decentralized information, not centralized information on a core server like with CrowdStrike, that means that you're duplicating the information onto a bad chain and the original chain. And if it turns out that that update was bad, well, then that chain just fizzles out and dies, right? And that's why you have to be very careful on which updates you have to Bitcoin, because if your update is bad, nobody's going to come save you, right? There's no central planner in Bitcoin that's going to bail you out and make sure that you're all okay, right? And so on the other end too, when it comes to the malice perspective, when people try to ban Bitcoin, try to shut down Bitcoin, let's say like China for the last 4 years, they've banned Bitcoin and clearly they're failing because people still there are using Bitcoin and mining Bitcoin. We can see that clearly with, just IP addresses and everything on the internet, right? We can clearly see that. Or many other nations, right? Putin tried, the Taliban tried, and many other places around the world tried to ban Bitcoin. They've all failed, right? North Korea is another example, right? They've all tried to ban Bitcoin and they failed, even though Bitcoin is this tiny little flicker that basically nobody uses. They've been able to squash it, right? Bitcoin's not this thing that, 20% of North Koreans use and, they've failed at getting this super vibe. No, Bitcoin's this tiny thing that barely anybody uses, and yet they've still failed at killing. Now, why is that? It's because Bitcoin does not rely on bigger gun diplomacy, right? Bitcoin relies on having more electricity. That's what Bitcoin relies on, right? It's not something analog that is my guns versus your guns, and whoever has the biggest guns wins. It's all about who spent more electricity, whether in the present or the past, and then defending that into the future, right? It's that if you have gold, or if you have real estate, or if you have a bench, I could enact bigger gun diplomacy on you and take your bench. I could take your gold. I could take your house. I could take whatever. You could do that with anything, and that's why bigger gun diplomacy works, because there's always something you can take with it. But with Bitcoin, because it's digital, yeah, I might be able to coax it out of you if I threaten maybe you or your children or something, to get you to give up your keys, but ultimately it's digital. And so I can't actually prove if you own that gold or not. And even if I could shoot you and I still can't take it, right? If you have $1 million of gold, I could shoot you and then take your gold, right? But even if I threaten you, even if I threaten your family or your business or whatever, I know that at the end of the day, I am not going to get your Bitcoin. If I kill you and I know that you have your seed phrase, how to get to your Bitcoin, ultimately, I'm not going to get it, right? And so some people would say, oh, well, what good does that do if you're still threatening me and this and that, the other? I get it. But at the end of the day, it's all about reducing the incentive. I think the better thing to do than bringing a solution to a problem is reducing the incentive for the problem to be exploited in the first place, if that makes sense, right? And so I think that is the significance with Bitcoin. If we get back to the AI point real quick, I think this is something else that's important to elaborate on, is that I got asked last night actually by a friend of mine who's like, oh, you're still in Bitcoin, right? Whatever. He was asking about Dogecoin and Shiba Inu and all these other things, right? Most of the other crypto tokens, digital tokens, are all proof of stake, right? Obviously. And so this is a fundamental problem with proof of stake. That with proof of stake, if you have a centralized ledger, and yeah, maybe you have nodes or validators or whatever validating that, but ultimately, if the fundamental ledger, if the source code of the ledger is from a centralized system, and it is stake-based and not work-based, work, energy, those words are, one and the same here in this example, ultimately, you can't verify if that has been tampered with or not, right? If you are in charge of proof of stake coin, where all the history of all the transactions and all the current transactions and all the future transactions are all written and recorded from this stake-based system, you can't really prove that this actually happened, because the stakers, the people in charge, might have changed that, right? Let's take the Federal Reserve as an example. Does the Federal Reserve just change transactions here and there? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I don't know. I don't really care, because in the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's malice or mistakes. In the end, because it's a proof of stake system, if the stakers validating those transactions, validating the ledger of that accounting system, of that monetary system, if they're negligent and ignorant and make mistakes, then it's flawed. Or if they're actually compromised, then it's flawed, right? So that system doesn't make sense, because atop a proof of stake system, and this is where things get really scary for me personally, thinking about the humans of the future, is that if your whole monetary system is based on who is the smartest, who has the most information, who has the best information, and who has the biggest guns in the analog world to defend that information, specifically speaking about monetary information here, then the question becomes, then you realize the game theory of this is that all that matters is who controls the AI, who controls the computers, who controls the digital software systems, just like CrowdStrike. This is exactly what we're seeing on a very, very tiny microcosm here that seems to be a mistake, but if we're seeing that tiny mistake, I bet there's a few terrorists right now. I bet there's a few nation states right now that are seeing that and thinking, ooh, we could leverage that to our advantage someday. Let's file that back in our notes of future possibilities, right? My point is, if your entire monetary system, what is a monetary system? A way to settle energy disputes, right? I have this much energy that I've worked for in the past, recorded it. You have that much energy. I've worked more in the past. I've worked with more leverage and success in the past. I have more monetary units in the system. Let's trade. Let's price this out in terms of those monetary units, whatever, right? That's what money is. Money is a labor allocation technology, right? If that system is defended by who is in control of the information, and you determine who controls the information by bigger gun diplomacy, then, like my point is, then all that matters is who has the AI, who has the computers, who has the information generators, securers, validators, right? That's all that matters. And atop of that system, atop of that proof of stake system that we are currently in, or any other theoretical other proof of stake system, that is the inevitable directional trend that's going to head. That we have an increasingly centralized honeypot. We have an increasingly huge incentive for people to go to war over that honeypot. And ultimately, we'll just see cycle after cycle after cycle of people competing for the ever more powerful seat of control and authority and power, right? Because if you have the smarter bots, if you have the bigger guns, or you have the better information, now you get to control the ledger. And you can manipulate the ledger to your advantage. You can change the numbers a little bit more at your advantage at the expense of other people, right? And this is exactly what we see with the US dollar. I just remembered I have real life examples here. I like to bring these out. I should bring these out more. I forget about it often enough, but I have multiple proof of stake examples here if I can talk and bring these out at the same time. So, okay, what do I have here? So, for example, we have Venezuelan bolivars, right? This is a token of the Venezuelan proof of stake political currency system, right? So within the borders of Venezuela, within the political regime of Venezuela, if you expend a certain amount of work, right, in the analog world, you are given a piece of information, which is, in this case, represented by this piece of paper, because this piece of paper doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. The paper doesn't matter. What matters is this is your entry into the ledger of Venezuelan's central bank, right? Banco Central de Venezuela, right? That's what matters, right? You are exchanging energy in the real world for information from the central bank that then you can exchange with other people, right? And so the only thing that matters in Venezuela is who controls that ledger, who controls the Banco Central de Venezuela, right? Now let's take another example here. Oh wait, this is also Venezuela. I have Zimbabwe's over here. So, to elaborate on this point with Zimbabwe, if I can get this out, it's the same thing in Zimbabwe. The only difference is that it's a different, it's a different geographic location, a different political system, right? But it's a different political system that runs on the same fundamental assumptions and the same fundamental security flaw, right? Is that in Zimbabwe, you have the ability to purchase information within the central bank of Zimbabwe. And it's the same problem, right? There's no difference between this political currency from South America and this political currency from Zimbabwe. The only difference is that you have a stake in one political currency system or a stake in another political currency system. Now, of course, you have bigger units, smaller units, right? It's all irrelevant. It's all just entries on a ledger. But this is the big one. This is the important one, right? This is the US dollar, right? What backs the US dollar? It's the Federal Reserve, right? Federal Reserve note, right? Previously, these used to be backed by gold because these were an entry in the ledger of some vault that held gold, right? And so if you had a gold-backed $20 bill, you held an entry to the ledger backed by energy, right? Gold takes energy to create, right? You can't just manifest gold out of nowhere, right? But now, since we're off a gold standard, this is an entry into a pure proof of stake system where we have, all the trust in the people that control and authorize the ledger, right? This $20 bill is worthless if you don't trust the Federal Reserve to accurately and correctly manage the monetary units within their accounting books, right? The dollar is completely worthless if you don't trust that little eagle seal there, right? And that's my larger point here, that the system that makes sense beyond this pile of paper is not which informational system that's backed by proof of stake is going to win, because in the end, the one created by the AIs, or more importantly, or probably better said, the one created by the human beings controlling and stewarding the AIs, that's going to be the one used. And that is a central bank digital currency. People freak out about central bank digital currency. It's kind of a fear porn term now. People are scared of it, right? Oh, central bank digital currencies is scary. My friend, we're already at the central bank digital currencies. The only difference is that a small, tiny portion of the central bank digital currency units are actually still represented by paper. We're already at a central bank digital currency. It's just the only difference is that the central bank's digital currencies of the future are going to be scarier than the ones today. Because which political currency system wins? It's the one that takes the most guns to back it, right? Why do we not work on a Zimbabwe or Venezuela global fiat standard? It's because the guns behind America are bigger. This informational system is worthless. It's worthless. It's made up out of thin air. The only reason it has value is because the people that decree this out of thin air have the bigger guns, and bigger gun diplomacy always trends to win. And so with Bitcoin, because it doesn't have a middleman, because it is peer-to-peer, because it does not have a central authority or a central staker or a central coder or a central database to say this amount of energy is worth that number of monetary units, because it's peer-to-peer and it completely cuts out that middleman by solving the Byzantine generals problem, that means that you don't have to have this anymore. It's completely irrelevant. And that is something that takes a long time to explain. It's something that you cannot explain to somebody in just a couple minutes, but you begin to internalize and realize what that means is that the information is the energy and the energy is the information. The information is not some made-up thing that's quasi-backed by energy, in this case, either gold in the past or guns today. And really with the gold, it's still backed by guns because you're defending the gold with the guns. And so that's Bitcoin, essentially. With AI, you cannot hack Bitcoin. You cannot take over Bitcoin. You cannot destroy Bitcoin because there's no central database that you can hack. There's no central thing you can do. The only way to rewrite Bitcoin and rewrite all of the entries into Bitcoin's ledger over the last 15 years, the only way to do that is to prove the work of going back block after block after block, hundreds of thousands of blocks, over 850,000 blocks or so, all the way back to Genesis and expend all of the energy, this is what SHA-256 is. And for context, and this is where numbers just don't make sense anymore, for context of how difficult is it to break SHA-256 and somehow secretly change the entries to Bitcoin's ledger of the past 15 years, the only way, conceivably, to decrypt or to break SHA-256 with modern computational systems is by having a computer so big, with so much energy, moving so much information, that it will take more mass of electrons moving computers, because that's really what computers are. They're just electrons and bits flipping from 1 to 0. You have to have so many of those bits. It's such a big computer. You would have to consume an amount of mass larger than that of the sun. Okay? What defends these political currencies? It's the entry to a ledger that a group of people in a proof of stake system decree this is what 1 unit of energy is worth, right? Some political currency systems have big unit bias, right? Like in this case, 10, 100,000, 10 trillion or 20, right? This 20 obviously is worth way more than the 10 trillion here, so the units are irrelevant. But with Bitcoin, because the information is the energy and the energy is the information, and they're interchangeable, that means that, wait a minute, if I'm going to use and leverage an AI to take the fatal shot and attack any of these political currency systems, I just have to change a central database or hack the central database or exploit a bad update, just like we're seeing with the the CrowdStrike bad update, right? You just have to have one bad update to a proof of stake system, and then you can rewrite all the past and all the future. The worst case with Bitcoin is that you add a bad update that going forward in the future has a bad fork. Well, then you just kill that and you go with how it was previously before that, right? You can't go backwards in Bitcoin, because to go backwards in Bitcoin requires a breaking of SHA-256. And to break SHA-256, it's not a matter of being smarter. It's not a matter of bigger gun diplomacy. It doesn't matter how many takes you bring. It doesn't matter how many AIs you develop and create. It just matters, can you flip enough bits in computers to somehow consume more mass than the entire solar system? Like, literally, it would be more difficult. You would have to leave the solar system and consume another star and throw it through a computer in order to break SHA-256, because If you're going to try to destroy the sun, well, then you've destroyed the Earth and the whole solar system too, for that matter, right? Now, obviously, the big question here is quantum computing. That's a whole nother discussion. I'm not going to get into that right now because that's a whole nother level here that we're not going to get into. But for the sake of modern computation as understood today, that is essentially how it works, right? And even with quantum computing, by the way, that's not an existential threat to Bitcoin. Again, elaborating and blabbering and ranting into how is not something that I think is worth it in this video. The larger point I'm making, the takeaway hopefully here, is that what we're seeing with CrowdStrike I think is really important because the world more and more and more is a digital world. It is not an analog world, a digital world. And in that digital world, we are increasing the incentive, increasing the honeypot, increasing the desires of malicious people to exploit weaknesses in that increasingly digital world. And also, horrible, ironic strokes of bad luck and ignorance and negligence, like perhaps what we're seeing in this CrowdStrike example specifically, have bigger and bigger consequences, right? There are way more human beings around today than there were 50 years ago, and there are way more human beings around 50 years ago than there were 500 years ago, right? The consequences of our security flaws in our systems is becoming larger and larger and larger. And if we're not careful, if we just blindly continue down this path where all the energy, all the banking systems, all the political systems, and everything else in human life is based atop a foundation of energy being settled based on who has the biggest guns and who has the ability to say, this is the ledger we're going to use and not that one because I say so. That is not a stable system. That is an open system. That's not a closed system. And so in the end, it doesn't matter if you trust humans or not. We're going to continue to have this instability. We're going to continue to have these mistakes, right? And so the best hope we can have is not solve the problem and patch the Band-Aid solutions up top. It's let's change the fundamental incentive. The incentive is no longer who has the biggest guns to now decree what the best ledger for money and therefore labor distribution is. Let's have a system instead. It's not based on politics. That's not based on bigger gun diplomacy, but instead that's based on pure work of the natural world consolidated via electricity into basically this decentralized algorithm that we call Bitcoin, right? Or as Jason Lowry would like to call it, bit power, right? I think even bit power perhaps is a better term for Bitcoin than Bitcoin in some ways, right? You know, for most people, it's probably not as analogous, but anyway, it's just a name, right? The name doesn't matter. The important thing is the system. Changing all the building blocks atop of the system from being real energy based on information to energy on top of energy. That makes a lot more sense to me, and I think that's going to have a lot better long-term future. So this video, I guess I didn't get really that technical. It was just a lot of rambling, but this is why I care about Bitcoin. This is why I talk about it, because I think we're going to see more and more of these security breaches and problems and flaws. And I think the best possible solution we can have at mitigating the negative consequences of this exponential curve of technological change is let's change the incentive from who controls the biggest guns to who produces the most electricity, because I think that is a much more equitable system. I think that's a much more fair system. And I think it doesn't matter if you have a security problem from ignorance or malice. In the end, it solves both of those problems at once. So, yeah, Bitcoin is the one thing the AIs can't hack. It's the one thing the AIs can't destroy. And I guess as a final point for the bullish perspective, think about this. If you're a person developing AIs, mega computers, AI data centers, whatever, here's a question. The AIs can hack any information in the world. The AIs can make any information in the world. The AIs can generate any photo, any video, anything in the world, right? You can impersonate anybody in the world. You could steal any identity in the world, right? With your AI machines, programming things in the real world, you know, you can control business. You can do basically anything with AI as long as it's a matter of controlling information. What's the one thing the AIs can't produce more of? As far as I can tell, the AIs, the only thing they can't produce more of is Bitcoin. It doesn't matter how many AIs you have. It doesn't matter how much time you have. And it doesn't matter how much electricity the AIs consume, produce, or expend. They can't create more Bitcoin. They just can't. They'd have to break SHA-256, right? And maybe in the future, we'll maybe even upgrade beyond that. But the point is, if the one thing AIs can't reproduce in the economic world is Bitcoin, what is going to be the thing that the AIs chase? what is going to be the thing that the AIs need to, quote unquote, live? And by live, I mean economically survive. I don't mean actually live, right? To me, I think it's Bitcoin. In 100 years, probably for every human being, there's going to be 5 or 10 or so of, bots or computers that have more computational power than the human brain, right? Or at least in terms of bits, right? What are they going to be working for? They're probably not going to be working for political currency. If you're an AI, why would you trust a human being that's going out at a podium and decreeing what the monetary policy is going to be? If you're an AI, you can't trust humans. You don't trust humans. And if you're an AI, you're not going to trust the other AIs. You're going to want the thing that is the closest in the digital world to raw, real, brute force, analog power. And in my opinion, that's Bitcoin. I think the AIs are going to work for Bitcoin. And I think, probably better said, the humans are going to continue to program the AIs to working to Bitcoin. Because if you're an AI, the one thing you need more than anything is electricity. To human beings, oxygen is what we need to live, right? Oxygen, nitrogen, right? To an AI, electricity is the thing AI needs. Because if you don't have electricity, you can't run your computers. You can't keep yourself alive, quote unquote, alive, right? And so I think that's really interesting. And so ultimately, I don't know where this is going to head. I don't know if there's going to be more attacks or mistakes like this, but it's quite concerning that we've had a critical failure with this CrowdStrike, with the Donald Trump assassination attempt, and with the solar flare issue, right? As we're upgrading the tech tree in human society, our problems are getting bigger, they're getting more complex, and we're not ready. What happens when the hacks get bigger? What happens when the updates get worse? What happens when we're no longer dealing with one shooter with one gun, but 10 assassins from across the planet, right? Not in analog space like the shooter was, but in digital space across the world flying. It's like, we're not ready for these questions. And I think the best thing we can do is align incentives away from having everything humans work for being energy based on information, proof of stake, to a system based on proof of work. It is everything the gold standard had, but infinitely better. Because even with the gold standard, in the end, the reason gold failed is because it was an analog space. You still had to resort to bigger gun diplomacy. We built a digital layer. We built a proof of stake layer atop of the proof of work layer of gold, right? The proof of work layer is gold. We built the proof of stake layer that is political currency atop of gold, right? And one final note, if you like holding your Bitcoin in an ETF, this is just one more reason to not trust the Bitcoin ETF. Because if the internet were to go down for, a day, or if we were to have another bad update like this whole CrowdStrike thing, it's like, I don't suspect that the ETF people would lose your information or whatever, but this is the point I'm talking about. If you actually own your Bitcoin in self-custody, you own the proof of work, actual Bitcoin. If you own paper claims to Bitcoin via an ETF product or even MicroStrategy stock or anything else, if you own paper claims to that, in the end, it's all paper. And maybe you trust that paper, maybe you don't, but ultimately understand that ETF Bitcoin has way more in common with all of these forms of paper than it does with actual Bitcoin, because your ETF Bitcoin, just like this paper here, is backed by bigger gun diplomacy. So that's all I got. That's my rant. I don't know. Hopefully that was interesting.